Hey there, fellow comic collectors. As always, I'm Scott Harris King. Today, I'm going to talk to you about something that I don't think most collectors really talk about with each other very much or think about too much in advance, and that is downsizing your collection. Yes, obviously, I'm doing a lot of videos where I'm bringing in a bunch of new comics in my haul videos, and it's so much fun to not just to buy those issues online, but it's really going to be great when everything opens back up. We can go out to all the comic book stores and the shows and dig through the dollar boxes, and it's really one of the most fun parts of collecting comics. But on the other hand, once you have the comics, they can become a bit of a burden. I've got over 10,000 comics, and I don't have space for 10,000 comics, but I also, on some levels, don't have mental space to own 10,000 comics right now. Now, I've mentioned this a few times. I've been having some health issues. Luckily, it turns out, seems like there's nothing serious at this point, but there were a few moments where, I had some nervous moments waiting for some test results, and I really started thinking and evaluating what my collection means to me in the scheme of my life, what I want to do with the collection. And I realized a couple things. The first part is owning the comics brings me a great deal of joy. However, if something were to happen to me, I wouldn't want to have these comics be a burden to my wife. She only knows about comics from what she's heard from me, which is a lot because I talk about it all the time. But I wouldn't want her to be stuck with the hassle of dealing with all of these boxes and boxes of comics. And when I say boxes of comics, I mean I've got piles of comics all over the room here, not even sorted into the actual boxes. And so the other thing is, I was like, what is really important to me in terms of collecting comics right now? I love reading them. I love looking at them. I love buying them. I love owning them. I derive a certain amount of enjoyment from having the comics, and then there's a different type of enjoyment from reading the comics. Um, but I realized that there's a lot of comics in my collection that are just sort of there. They don't really bring me any enjoyment other than being able to say, oh, I've got a complete run of Ghost Rider. Am I ever going to reread those issues? Well, only if I'm going to do a podcast about them. Otherwise, they've sit in my box for almost 30 years since the last time I've read them. And frankly, I don't remember most of them being good enough for me to want to spend my time rereading them. And so I started thinking, well, what really brings me a lot of enjoyment and satisfaction these days is making comics. So I realized that, let's say that, God forbid, I had gotten some bad test results and they said, you've got 5 years to live or something. I realized the first thing I would do is sell off a lot of my comics to reduce the burden on my wife, but also so I could raise some money to make some comics that I want to make. I have lots of ideas. I'm a writer, so I have tons of story ideas, but I'm very slow as an artist. There's only so much time in the day I can devote to drawing. That's why it takes me 8 or 9 months to do a single issue of the Crime Busters. It's all the drawing just takes forever. But if I had the money to hire other artists, I could do lots of other comics as well because I could write them much, much faster than I can draw them. With all that in mind, I've decided to go ahead and downsize it. Once I realized that there was a lot of stuff in my collection that's not actively bringing me enjoyment, but it's just sort of this, has a little bit of a mental burden of owning the stuff. And then there's also comics where I've collected them, I've never read them, and I feel this like pressure to someday like read these comics. Like I've amassed this collection, I should read them before I get rid of them. And it's just sort of a weight, like, because I don't want to read them or else I would have done it already. And so what I did was I decided to go ahead and sell off some of my collection. And in this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about how exactly that process works. Of course, the first point is just to determine whether you want to downsize your collection. Lots of people have different reasons. It's been a really tough year for people, so a lot of people need money. Luckily, that's not the case for me. It's more a case of wanting the money. But the first thing I did was I simply went through all of my boxes and just did a determination. Is this something that I want to keep? Or is this something that I'd be comfortable selling? And this process was surprisingly easy. And I think that is a good indication that I'm ready to sell some of the stuff. Because when I went through the boxes, there was a bunch of stuff that I clearly want to keep. I definitely want to keep my Avengers collection because not only do I love the stories, more importantly, they have a lot of emotional connection for me and meaning for me. I'm actively collecting romance comics. It brings me a lot of pleasure to put those runs together and occasionally read them, but just look at the art, look at the covers. And that's where my focus is right now. Same with Archie. Archie is a little bit different than collecting the romance. Yes, some of the older ones can be more expensive, but Archie is a series where I derive a lot of enjoyment from actually reading the issues. You know, it's sort of brings me back to my childhood. It's just sort of a very soothing and relaxing thing to read a handful of Archie stories. A lot of them are interchangeable. There's a lot of really mediocre ones, and yet there's a certain sort of a sense of comfort. You know, Archie for me is kind of a comfort food comic, and so I'm gonna want to keep my Archie collection as well. Uh, but once I got past that stuff, there was a lot of things where it actually turned out to be very easy. I look at this box and I go, don't need to keep that. Don't need to keep that. I'm never going to reread it. I'm never going to read it. Stuff that I enjoy, stuff that I really like, but I just haven't reread them in 20 years, 30 years. And as much as I enjoy having them and I liked it and I have a warm feeling towards it, I know that I'm never going to read them again. I'm never going to pull them out of the box. I've got runs of comics that I haven't pulled out of the box. And so it actually only took me a couple hours to just go box by box and be like, yes, keeping. Nope, I'm okay with getting rid of that. Now, there were a few that were sort of on the fence. There were a couple long running series that I'm close to finishing, and I had that thing in my head: is should I finish the collection, knowing that I might sell it, or should I decide to keep it? And in those cases, most of them I decided to keep. Because a lot of times I haven't read the runs, and so there's some of these ones where I do want to read them, and I'm very close. There's other ones where I've completed the run, like Master of Kung Fu. I haven't read it. I hear great things about it. I'm expecting to like it. Haven't got around to reading it. Definitely going to keep that. Now, once I do get around to reading it, I might at that time decide to sell it. We'll see. If I don't like the series, I'm going to get rid of it. But there were only a handful of titles where I was legitimately on the fence. There was a couple that I originally earmarked to sell and then decided to keep. And there was a couple others where I was really surprised that I decided to sell them. But once I just thought about it for 5 seconds, even just my initial instinct is, it's been great having these. It's great that I had them and was able to read them, but like in some cases just the series is really bad. I don't want to reread it again. It's almost keeping around for reference material. And if that's the case, I'd rather get just read it online, and sell it off, make a bunch of space, like literal space, make some mental space of just knowing that that's done with, and also raise a bit of money to make some new comics. So there was a couple of runs that really surprised me. At some point I'll get into exactly what I sold, but until I'm done with the process, I don't really want to get into that too much. But then the next thing is to decide how you're going to sell them. Now, one thing I want to mention here is that there's some tax laws that just went into effect, or they're just like signed into law this year, that are going to affect this. And the one you need to know about is that it used to be, up until now, that if you sold stuff online through like eBay, for instance, if you sold more than $20,000 over the course of the year, eBay is required by law to send you like a, whatever it is, a 1099 or 1095, I forget, but send you a tax form, and then you're supposed to report it as income. But again, only if you make over 20,000. That's changing as of this year. So when you do your taxes next year, I think it's going to affect right away, like beginning of next year. So I'm not sure if you have to report this year's taxes or if it starts with the next tax year. But either this year or next year, they're implementing a thing where now that threshold is all the way down to $600. So if you sell over $600 worth of stuff on eBay, you're going to have to be taxed on it. Now, I don't fully understand the tax implications, because normally, like, if I was reporting something as income from a business, then I would be able to also report expenses. But for something like this, let's say I have, let's use that Run a Ghost Rider as an example. I haven't actually sold it yet, but let's say I did, and I sold that on eBay, and I got $400 for it. I mean, I think I should be able to also deduct a cost for buying those issues, right? Because it's not all profit. I had to buy those, but I bought them 30 years ago. So I'm still trying to figure out the tax implications of this myself, but it's something to be aware of, because if you sell through other venues, then you may not have to deal with these tax implications. I think technically you're supposed to file them, but other places, there's exceptions. For instance, I was reading that there's an exception if you occasionally sell used items through something and get paid through PayPal. It's an exception and they don't have to charge you for it, right? And so I think what this might end up doing is driving people to sell through other channels, more Facebook sales, more Instagram sales. I think there's people that even sell stuff here on YouTube, although I've never gotten involved with that. Of course, the downside to those is that eBay provides you as a seller with certain protections that you do not have if you're just selling it like under the table. You know, if you make a deal with someone on Facebook and then you sell it via a PayPal payment, you're not necessarily going to have the full protection of that. There's some protections through PayPal if you do it as a business transaction, but then again, tax liabilities may come into play there. And so it's just something to keep in mind. If you have large collections, or even now smaller collections that you're selling, there's going to be tax implications depending on how you decide to do it. Now, for me, I sell through the CGC forums first and foremost, because that's where a lot of the hardcore collectors are that are looking for some of the more esoteric stuff. I can also sell to them directly and avoid all the eBay fees. You know, if you go through eBay now, they charge you a fee, but then they also take out like a second fee, and then they charge you a fee on the shipping amount. And so there's a lot of fees. If you're selling more directly, you don't have to worry about that as much. You might still get the PayPal fee, but you won't have the listing fee. So I usually go to CGC first. I only use eBay second. But that's basically how I've done it. I did one sale thread so far with some of my modern stuff, which is not very much because I don't collect modern. But I went through, I found some stuff that I no longer want in my collection, and I was able to sell some of it through the CGC forums, get the money through PayPal, avoid the eBay fees. Everything else that was left that I wanted to sell that didn't sell in CGC forums, I put on eBay. And I think eventually, my experience has been everything I've put on eBay has eventually sold, but sometimes it takes quite a while. Figuring out the pricing is a whole nother aspect to it, but that's just something to keep in mind. And part of something that you want to consider is the idea of selling things as individual issues or as lots. Now, there was a lot that I put up on the CGC forums that was a huge run. It was 200 straight issues of a title, and I was asking for $450, and that included shipping. And now shipping these days is crazy expensive depending on where you're shipping to. Now, I live on the East Coast, and the price of a package to the East Coast versus the West Coast is completely different. I had a box that I was trying to send that in order to send it here to the East Coast was something like $15, but to send that same package to the West Coast was $56. And so what I've started doing is whenever possible, I try, and if I'm going to sell a lot, I'll use these medium flat rate priority boxes. There's two different sizes, but this size here is the correct shape for comic books. And it doesn't look very deep, right? It's that deep. But actually, this can hold just over 50 comics comfortably. So if you put in a little bit of, I put in some extra cardboard, I bubble wrap, I can put 50 comics in one of these boxes. So when I sell lots, I try and break them up into groups of 50 if it's like random stuff, or if it's a long run, sometimes I'll tell people, depending on where you live, you may be getting 2 boxes instead of 1. Well, I had to do that the other day where I was sending a big shipment to a guy, and it turned out that it cost twice as much to send it in 1 box as it did to send it in 2 priority boxes. It was only, I think, $27 to send the 2 shipments in 2 of these boxes. But in order to do it in 1 box, it was like 58. So that is something to keep in mind, is if you're selling lots, the size of the lots. When on eBay, I do everything with these priority mailboxes, and I pass the cost on to the buyer, so I can avoid just some of the craziness. I don't sell anything out of the country because that can get even crazier in terms of prices. The other thing, though, to keep in mind in terms of if you're going to be selling lots versus individual issues. So back to that big lot, right? 200 issues, I was asking $450. Nobody bought it. And that was including shipping. So it was basically asking $400 plus shipping. Here's the crazy thing. Inside that run were 2 or 3 issues that are currently blowing up online for speculation because of movies and TV shows. And if I had just sold those individual issues, just those like 3 spec issues, right? It would have been looking at something like $250. So basically, I was asking $400 for a 200 issue lot, and almost all of the value was in just a handful of minor keys that are just blowing up on speculation. This is something I've found to be true for years across the board. You will make more money selling the comics individually than you will as a lot. Now, it kind of seems backwards to me. When I'm offering someone a complete run of a series, to me, it seems like there should be a premium because I've done all the hard work. I've spent all the years putting this run together, and the person can now get it all at once. But in fact, my experience has been that you usually have to offer them at a discount to have someone buy the entire run. Now, part of this is because people are buying, if they're trying to buy it, a lot of times they already have some of the issues. So they have to factor in, they may already have half of them. And so they don't want to pay full price for something where they only need half of the issues. But it's just a weird dynamic where I had a lot that I sold to someone, again, where there was a couple key issues in the run that actually cost more individually than I sold the whole 100 issue run for. I don't know if that person was buying it to read that, or they very well may have been buying it to just take the keys out, flip the keys, right, and then just dump the extra issues and make a little bit of money that way. So it's just something to keep in mind. I still decided to sell in lots whenever I can because it's so much easier. It's almost like I'm giving people a discount in order to take the comics, because the amount of time it takes to scan or photograph 200 individual issues and list them all, like if you're going to put them on eBay, list them all individually, it'll take like days and days of working on that to do that many comics. It's a crazy amount of work. Whereas this way I can just take like a couple photos, a couple scans of the key books, put up one listing. And so for me, it's worth losing a potential amount of money. It's also worth it to me to get the money now, as opposed to being like, okay, here's a 100 issue lot. I could sell it all now, or I could sell one issue here and there occasionally for the next 2 years before I manage to get rid of all of them. So those are just things to think about. There's different ways to do it. A lot of people, prefer to maximize their potential. They'll pull the keys out. The third way to do it is to pull the keys out and sell the keys individually, and then sell the rest as lots at a discount. That is another way to go. You might make a little bit more money that way. What I think I'm going to end up doing is, when all said and done, because I'm a run collector, what I have mostly is complete runs. So I'm keeping them as lots. I don't want to break up the runs. It's kind of important to me as a collector. I am going to be left over with some stuff that doesn't fit into any categories. And so I'm putting together like random lots, of just like, here's 50 DC superhero books and stuff like that. And those usually sell for less than, again, if you were to sell them individually, but it's a good way to get things out the door. I'm going to be left probably with a whole short box of like just complete nonsense that nobody is going to want to pay for. I'll probably sell some of that stuff on Craigslist, which is always another option. It's also a way to avoid the tax implications. There's people that sell even key issues and big comics through Craigslist, but that's a wild west. So I try to avoid that if I can. And of course, the other thing you can do is you can give away the comics, and that's a good time for me to remind people that currently, as I'm recording this, I'm at 236 subscribers. I am holding a contest. When I get to 250, I'm giving someone a mystery box, and that is going to include some of my downsizing comics. There are some cool comics that I just don't fit in my collection anymore. I'm going to get rid of them, and at some point I might sell them, but before that point, I'm going to be giving some of them to someone when I hit 250 subscribers. So I'll have the link below if you haven't signed up for that. But these are just some things to keep in mind. Again, we'll just to go over it real quick at the top. Determine if downsizing is right for you. Think about why you're collecting, what enjoyment you derive from it. And if downsizing is right for you, for me, again, it was a surprisingly easy process. Once I really had committed to the idea of selling some of my comics, it became very apparent to me very quickly which ones mattered to me, either because I want to reread the story or because I have an emotional connection to the comics, and which ones were just taking up space and hanging around. I've got boxes and boxes of stuff that I don't even know why I've been buying it. I've been collecting one series. Just when I see them cheap, I just buy it. And I've got over 100 issues of this series that I don't care at all about. I was just doing it to see if I could do it. Well, the answer is yes, I could do it, but why am I doing that? So I'm going to get rid of those, stuff like that. And then when you do sell, again, keep in mind the tax implications that can be a big factor in where you decide to sell, and keep in mind how you want to sell. In lots, split lots, or just sell the keys, dump the rest. Individual issues, you'll always make more money selling individual issues, but it's going to take way more work and a lot more time. So these are just some of the things. And then, of course, there's the other option, which is to not downsize at all. Now, would I be downsizing if I had more physical space? I think so, but it's hard to say. The fact is, I've hit my limit of how many comics I can fit in the space that I have. And as a result, everything's a mess. There's piles of comics everywhere. I needed to create space anyway, but I'm basically going to be selling off about 40% of my collection. Maybe a little bit less depending on how a couple of these go, but I'm going to sell off at least a third of my collection during this downsizing, and that is going to make plenty of room for me to then sort of refocus on the comics that I want to be making and the comics that I still want to be collecting, like the romance and the Archie stuff, as I continue to shift away from superheroes and into other genres. So anyway, I just want to talk about this. I think most people, when you talk about comics or with other collectors, you don't often talk about getting rid of the comics and what to do with comics that you no longer care about, or what to do with your whole collection. In some cases, it's a really tough decision to make, to get rid of your collection or part of your collection. And so I thought it might be valuable for some people just to have some insight into my process and how I decided that and the way I'm going about doing it. So if you have any questions about the downsizing process, feel free to leave them below. I'll tell you what I've experienced. And thanks very much for watching. I'll see you next time.